Today is World Book Day. The United Nations Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has spoken today about the role of books and their value in his life and in this time of crisis and isolation. One of the biggest bibliophiles we know is the researcher and commentator Angelo Fick. He's pointed out South Africa has just not addressed the inequalities in access to books in all languages. He joins us now via Skype, but he's in what is actually just a very small section of his library, the library at home. He calls it the Imperial Library for various reasons. Angelo, so good to see you. Even better, if I may say, to see a part of your library on TV this afternoon. Firstly, we're going to come to inequality with books in a moment, but firstly, books are friends, they're ideas, they're also a sort of window into our interior life.
They are all of those things, but there are also ways in which we explore the world, try and explain the world to ourselves, try and explain both the internal and the external world, not only to ourselves, but to one another. And as James Baldwin once said, you think you're the first person or the only person to experience something, and then you read a book and you realize that others have and continue to experience what you do. And so books are a way of connecting with people's experiences, and also not just in your own time, but in times before. And I think in a crisis like this, often it is those of us trying to make meaning of what goes on at the moment, use what have been reported in books about previous crises to make sense of this moment as well.
I mean, there's a great conversation to have about the dry facts you get from a really good work of non-fiction. It can provide analysis. And yet sometimes only a novel can tell you what World War II or the Spanish flu epidemic or 1976 in South Africa actually felt like.
Indeed, and also what novels, short stories and poems and drama works do is they allow us to access structures of feeling, to think of how other people think of their feelings, how they construct them, how they work through them. And so books are ways in which we also connect with other people. We learn not only how to feel about ourselves, but how other people feel about themselves and about us through books, and not just people in our own time, but people in previous epochs of history. So we can also see how structures of feelings have changed over the centuries in different societies, in different cultures, in different languages.
Let's talk a little bit about one of the problems we have, and in a way that books sort of mirror our society. So almost all children in South Africa, if they go to any bookstore, they go to any library, whether it's a municipal library or their school library, are going to find almost all of the books, even the children's story books, do not reflect their lives. The characters do not look like them, do not speak the language that they speak. This is a huge issue.
It is a very big issue, and it's not an issue that I think is new in South Africa. So one of the problems that we haven't addressed in post-apartheid South Africa over the last 25 years is the ways in which indigenous languages in South Africa remain fairly marginalized, except as demotic languages. So they're the languages people speak. But they're not the languages that we see visible in public as languages of reading. They're not the languages we hear often from officials of state or in documentation as official languages. And they certainly aren't considered by many people, including people who speak those languages, as languages of science and scientific expression. And here I think is an important occasion for us to think of indigenous languages as not just expressing indigenous cultures, indigenous ideas, indigenous beliefs, and ways and patterns of being, but we should give children access to the world in those indigenous languages, the way Japanese children, Russian children, Italian children, Turkish children are given access to the world by having the world's literature translated for them into mother tongue. And this is something that Afrikaans had in apartheid South Africa, that you had Andre Brink's translation of Don Quixote into Afrikaans. It should be available in Tshivenda, in Xitsonga, in isiZulu. The world's literature should be available to everyone in this country in their indigenous language. They can then read the translation or the original in Spanish or in French or in English later. But I think it's important for young children, people between the ages of 3 and 9, to see their language reflected as a language in which you can express the world. You cannot just express Guyani in Tshivenda. You can also begin to express Tokyo and Berlin, and not just the present. You can represent 19th century Russia through Tolstoy's works translated into Tshivenda.
Now, there's a whole conversation to have about the emancipation of the serfs and what happened at the end of apartheid, just as an example. If you go to the countries that you talk about, you go to Japan, you go to Turkey, you go to Rome, you go to Berlin, you will see anyone in public transport will be reading. They'll be reading a newspaper, or they'll actually be reading a novel in many cases. We don't have that here, and there are lots of reasons why. You've already expressed some of them. Do you think we'll ever be able to change that? And this really goes to the heart of the issue, that books are not available to children in their own languages.
So my experience is slightly different from that, one of the people who actually read more African literature than I'd read was a man who was a taxi driver and waited for his cab fare outside of the Wits University campus on a daily basis for 4 to 5 years. And he had read almost all of the Heinemann African Writers Series imprint items that he could lay his hands on. And he did that reading in between, waiting for students who wanted to be taken home or to another campus, or for other people in Braamfontein who wanted to travel somewhere. And I think there is a hunger for reading. We see this in ordinary people reading the Bible. You see this in people sitting and reading what they can get access to. What we do need in South Africa is to stop thinking of books as luxury items. Their import should not be as heavily taxed as it is. There should be the encouragement of a local publication industry of not just local works, but imported and translated works. And here I think the various departments of government that are responsible for this should begin to look to this more carefully. Department of Arts and Culture, Department of Science and Technology, the two departments of education should all work together to actually begin to make reading, as the President told us at the beginning of this year, part of the everyday South African experience as an accessible experience, because many people do read and want to read more, but they cannot afford in this country the cost of books, because many of the books are imported, they're highly expensive, they're highly taxed, and that shouldn't be the case. That books are more readily available in countries like Nigeria and Kenya than they are in South Africa is truly a kind of, an indictment on us as a society.
Angelo Fick, do appreciate the time, and thank you very much indeed for letting us into just that small corner of his Imperial Library. Follow him on Twitter and he will show you pictures of that. Go through his Twitter feed. You'll be amazed at how many books he's got crammed there. Angelo, thanks very much indeed.